Come on. The Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. I'm your host. I have no particular skills of any sort when it comes to the avian world. I'm just into it, as they say. And it's fortuitous because it's one of those days today where everything is closed. So there's not a whole lot to do other than talk birds. But it's a Friday, so it's Photography Friday. But we can pretend it's Thursday, and we could call it Tour Guide Thursday. And the marvellously handsome man that is facing me in the virtual world, sorry to the podcast-only listeners who cannot see, that the man who looks a lot like Michael Chugg, and Australian music fans will know exactly who Chuggy is. For the rest of you, Google him. Ewen Bell, welcome to the Bird Emergency. Thank you for joining me.
Great to be here, Grant. Thank you very much.
Ewen, we were just discussing before I pushed the big red button and launched us into space. Photographer and a tour guide. How did birds get into your orbit?
The birds have been there for quite a while because I used to work in a research capacity, and I spent a few years in the zoology department at the University of Melbourne. And I have an interest in wildlife and science and nature, and I like being out in nature. And so the birds to me is like the easiest way to connect with the wilderness, and it's the easiest way to connect with the nature because they're everywhere. And anywhere you go, it could be hard to see a crocodile or a lion or something, but it's always easy to find some birds. And it was actually Andrew Stafford who really turned the whole game for me. I got to spend some time with him in the Northern Territory to work on a project where I was shooting, and he was actually trying to find the birds and I was doing the photography. And I got it. I understood as, wow, these guys can find these birds. The skill they have and the talent they have is one thing, but also the joy and the passion that he had was really fantastic. And that's really, that was the start of it, where I started to really think about birds rather than wildlife.
Now let's give Staffo cheerio. I haven't actually met Staffo, but Staffo's been a big part of my life for a long time because he wrote the outstanding book Pig City.
And he may have to.
Yep, he did the 10-year anniversary update. But again, sorry, bird people, but if you're into the alternative music scene in Australia from the 80s and 90s and Brisbane, which had the then nickname Bris Vegas, Andrew Stafford is the authority. But he's a sports nut as well. Staffo. If you look him up, Andrew Stafford, and you find him on Twitter, follow him on Twitter, you will not be disappointed. He's very entertaining. And like all good folk that you come across in the world, he's got a thing for birds. So good on you, Staffo.
He does.
So while we brought Staffo up, what do you reckon was his special skill out in the field?
I think that there are two things. One, he cares about the birds. And I think that's usually where people like ourselves come from. We want to see the birds out there. We want to see them do well. We want to see their habitat protected. And he gets a kick out of seeing them out there. But he can find them when the rest of us are just walking down a trail and all we see are trees and bush. And he'll go, oh, wait, stop. And he'll hear something, and it's the sound. He picks up on the sounds, and he can tell you like 20 kinds of species that are actually around you that you can't see yet, but he's heard them.
That's one of the delights of just being out in the bush, isn't it? That you can just sit and you can zone in on how busy. That's something that most people, as they tramp past with their backpacks, they'll just be saying, oh, there's nothing here. This is boring. And yeah, I think that's one of the great joys and that thing, is it a record if you don't see it? If you can clearly identify it by hearing it, can you tick it off on your list? What do you think?
Here's where I'm far more of a photographer than a birder. I don't keep lists. I don't have an interest in seeing a bird because I haven't. I simply have an interest to connect with the landscape that I'm standing in. And the birds are just a wonderful way to do that because they express the habitat, they express the landscape. When you go up to an alpine area, the birds are different to when you're in like a low-lying forest or the wetlands, or the birds change. And I see the connection with the landscape coming through the birds. And as a photographer, they're a challenge. And they used to be a much harder challenge than they are now. It used to be you had to carry so much gear and you had to really have a lot more patience and to get on a plane with a lot more check-in because of all the camera gear that you were trying to get on the aircraft. And now you can do the whole thing with a tiny little handheld camera. In fact, Mine's here right now. That is basically an 800mm lens.
Now that's a Lumex.
Yeah, they're tiny.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. This is the G9 with a 100 to 400mm, but because it's got a smaller sensor, the 400 gives you an 800mm perspective, and it is light. You can pack it in your bag to walk anywhere and go, oh, look, there's a parrot, and you pop it up and off you go.
So that camera there, and again, I'm sorry, podcast listeners, but it was an SLR-looking format, but is that an SLR?
No, it's not.
So it's a straight-through mirrorless. And with that lens on it, which for those of you who think the way I do, there's really big lenses, then there's like normal lenses. This one's about 1/3 the way along the scale, I would say. I would have thought. Now, how many weeks' wages is that going to set you back with a nice lightweight collapsible tripod?
You don't need the tripod. You're going to save yourself a couple of $100 there, but we're probably looking at somewhere between $3,000 to $4,000 for the total rig, depending on the specials on the day. The G9's been around now for probably 3 or 4 years. They're not a brand new design, so the prices have come down. But that lens, it just seems like a harmless lens. You think that couldn't possibly do you much good. It's just a small camera with a tiny sensor and a tiny lens, and you don't think it's going to be very good. And I did an exhibition from Bhutan where I took this camera out, this particular one that's in my hand now. I took that to Bhutan, and I was there for 10 days, and we shot a whole bunch of birds, and the exhibition was beautiful. And when you see these great big prints coming off this tiny little camera, that's when you believe that the technology has really taken you somewhere forward. But the point is that with that camera, I could have it on me the whole time. It was like really easy to pack. It was easy to put in a bag. Here I jump on a tram and I go up to Royal Park and I just have that in my bag, and I don't look like a photographer. I don't have a whole bunch of gear. I don't look weird and creepy on public transport.
Is that what photographers look like?
If you've got an 800mm lens out, it looks kind of odd. And so I just look harmless. And it means that we talk about tripods and things. I've got a shot with this camera, which I took handheld at 1/80 of a second at the maximum 800mm perspective. Handheld, the sun has gone down, and I've got this tiny little blue-capped redstart. It's in the Himalayas, and he's on this branch, and I just let the continuous mode go through, and probably half of those shots are absolutely pin sharp. So the stabilization that's actually inside the lens and the camera does a lot of the hard work. You no longer need a tripod. That's a big deal.
Okay. Well, I'm sure a number of our listeners are not in a position to just lay down 3 to 4K on that rig. That's definitely a professional standard rig. What would you suggest as an entry level gear? And bearing in mind that so much good secondhand stuff is available, would you suggest that looking for a good mirrorless option nowadays it is the way to go, or do you progress through the DSLR range?
Look, I don't think it's critical whether you've got an SLR or mirrorless. The differences aren't that great. It really comes down to the size of the sensor and the quality of the lens. So the smaller the sensor, you get a longer reach with the same lens. So if you have a secondhand, a smaller sensor on a Canon 7D or a 7D Mark II, something like that, if you put a 400mm lens on that, you're going to get a 600mm perspective, okay, because it's got a smaller sensor.
Now, just pretend that I haven't got a clue what you're talking about, and I'm looking through the specs on a website or something. What am I looking for a small sensor? Where do I find that in the specs rundown?
This is where it gets a little bit confusing. Anything that says APS-C size sensor or a partial frame. The idea was when they first started to make the digital sensors, they tried to make them full frame, which means the same size as your SLR, as like the film, the 35mm film.
Yeah, the back screen.
Yeah.
That's okay.
That's right. The bit that captures the picture. But they worked out it was cheaper if they just made them half the size. And so they called it like a partial frame or a crop sensor. It got a little confusing there for a couple of decades, or like 10 years or so. Sony were running this campaign where they would talk about their full-size Exmor sensor. And of course, that means it was a full-size partial frame sensor, is really what they were saying. So it wasn't full-size at all. It was very confusing. This is where sometimes the marketing people, they're not as honest as the actual engineers. And so nowadays they have actual full-size sensors, plus they still have the smaller one, so it gets confusing. It's really hard trying to work out what's inside your camera. It's a pain in the neck. It really is.
Let's put the gear discussion for a minute. I've got a couple of questions about getting started with gear for you, but let's talk more birding. How did you get into guiding?
Guiding wasn't something I planned on actually doing. That was an accident. I used to shoot brochures for a couple of tour companies, and that's where I crafted my skills with travel and photography. And I met some really good guides during that time. And I met some who weren't so good as well, but generally they were pretty good. What I also saw was that sometimes companies make it very difficult for their guides to do a good job. And companies will have all these rules and stuff where if they think they can save $10 per person per day, they will put the screws on the guides to find ways to squeeze out that $10. And it's not always in the interest of the traveler.
Let's be specific. What kind of tactics do bad tour companies do to save? How do they put the pressure on you as a guide to save $10 a day?
Okay, there could be things like if you've got a cooking class that's part of a small group tour, and you go to and the guide has to organize that cooking class, and there could be 3 of them in town, but they want you to go to the crappy one that's cheaper, not the one that's actually really good and that everybody enjoys much more. The other thing that happens a lot, there's a lot of argy-bargy that goes on with hotel rooms. And I could write a book about some of the dirty stuff that these companies do behind the scenes that you'd have to question their foundation of ethics, some of the things they do to the local operators and the local guides. But we're not here to write a novel just yet. But
that's a really interesting issue, though, Ewan. And I think there's probably more than 2 types of travellers, but you've seen a lot more travellers, customers, clients than I have in this field, obviously. If I was sitting in your seat and if I was the tour operator, the ethics of dealing with the locals would be probably number 1 or number 2. Maybe getting access to the birds might be number 1. And then dealing ethically with the locals might be number 2. So my question is, I'm guessing that a lot of the company owners and operators don't really give a stuff, but how hard is it for you as a guide who's the middleman to be in the middle? Do you ever have to compromise yourself, or do you perhaps lose out personally, financially or something, to ensure that the local operators get treated well?
You could argue that I'd lose out financially, but I don't really see it in those terms. I see it as if the local guys do well and I don't make any money this year, that's okay, because I'll come back with another group next year and perhaps I'll do better then. We're just getting confused, I think, between the local guides and like the tour operator here in Australia. There's a combination of ways to look at it. I think that in general, the larger the company, the less strong the connection is between the owners or the people who make the financial decisions and the actual people on the trip. So the smaller the company, the better the owners understand. Actually, it's a bad idea to cut corners here. I think we actually need to spend more, and we'll get that back next year. It's okay. It's only so one of my rules was when I became aware of this $10 problem, I tried to turn it into $100 solutions. So when I started to run my own tours with the help of a fantastic guide called Jason Williams, and he was a cycling guide and he was doing lots of cycling tours, but he was moving at the same kind of pace that I like to do a photography tour. And it turns out we worked really well together. But Jason has gone on to do other things now. But Jason and I came up with this rule of every single day, let's see if there's $100 extra we can spend somewhere. That's just going to add something to the trip. And that could mean that one day we spend $1,000 to go up in a balloon, or it could mean we buy some ice creams because we're going to be late. It doesn't really matter. But it's just about changing the psychology and saying, stop trying to save $10 here and there, because that's a really shit way to treat people, actually.
And you can only go one way, like from year to year. If you're actually an owner, and your mentality is only ever to save money, there's only one way your tour and your operation ever goes, and that's down.
For us, it was like we weren't ever going to do more than 3 or 4 trips per year anyway. So we're not doing thousands of seats. So that $10 doesn't really hurt us, really. It's not like we get paid per hour. There are trips I do where I earn absolutely nothing, and there are trips I earn where I do really well. And you don't always know how that's going to play out. And you just have to turn off that part of your brain that's just being cheap and just you want to find ways to make that experience much better. And now, of course, here we're talking about small group tours, we're talking about photography tours, we're talking about gourmet tours. Once you get into birding tours, the rules do change a little bit because it's a different audience.
Okay, let's just chase that one down the rabbit hole a little bit before I get right into birds. How different are birders and birding tours compared to your cooking tours?
They're chalk and cheese. They're really different people and they're really different goals. The gourmet stuff we do is really handcrafted. You're creating an experience. Whereas generally it's hard to run a bird tour that's not entirely focused on trying to tick as many off the list as possible. They're very different goals. And really, the thing that I find interesting to compare is if you compare the photographers who shoot birds versus the birders who take photos, because these are absolutely worlds apart. They're not the same people, it turns out.
Pass that out. Who is who and what do they do?
So I'll give you a case in point because I know a few bird guys and we have had a lot of chats about where we can spend money and where we can't and all this kind of stuff and what the passengers are like and what they want. I was on a ship in Papua New Guinea to take photographs for the cruise company, a very small Kiwi mob called Heritage. Really great guys, just absolute heart of gold. The guides that they get, the Kiwis on this boat are just fantastic. They're great people. And so essentially what they were doing, they have to sail their boat from the Arctic to the Antarctic and then back each year to reposition. Although not so much this year, of course, but in a normal year. And so on their way down, they spend like a 2-week trip going through eastern Papua and then 2 weeks going through western Papua. Sorry, they start in western Papua and then they go through PNG and Micronesia
and Flora. Oh, they're coming the other way.
Yeah, so they go down to, yes, how I got on the boat in Papua New Guinea and then in the top end and then I got off in...
And then the Solomons, the kind of...
That's right. So just... fantastic thing to do, fantastic experience. I'm so glad I got a chance to do this. Now, on that boat was a very good bird expert. He knew his stuff. He was young and capable, and he had sort of probably 7 or 8 people who were just there to see birds. And so his job was not to worry about the rest of the passengers on the boat. He just had to take care of this mob. So he would take them out in the Zodiac pre-dawn and head off to get up to a patch of river or to walk up a hills somewhere. And so I spent just a couple of days where I would spend some time with the birding mob instead of the rest of the mob because I'm trying to capture the whole story of this journey and the things that they see and locals that they meet. And the thing that was really interesting is that the guys in that Zodiac suddenly had a photographer who's worked for National Geographic, who writes for a whole bunch of publications, who teaches, who runs like a mentoring program. And they didn't want to know anything that I had to say. They just had no interest in the actual photography whatsoever. They were all holding cameras. They were all taking shots.
They just wanted to get a shot and say, look, here, I saw it. Here it is. Here's the proof.
Yeah, it could be that. And to me, there was a sense of they felt that they had the skills they needed. So they were okay. It's okay. That's nice. We like the shots that you're taking, but we're not interested to talk about the photography. We want to talk about, and that's
so
where
they're not into growing their skill base as photographers. They're there to enhance their birding experience, and that's all.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that was a really big thing for me to understand and to take in. It was just like, okay, I should stop trying to help birders to take better photos because there's not many who want to take a better photo because they probably take some pretty good photos to begin with. But that's not where they want to head. And as you say, they're more interested in something that shows the bird that they saw than creating a piece of art. And for me, photography is art. And I want to express something and to show something beautiful through that. So I get really excited when I see some photography of birds that's just a little bit beautiful and is really about the art, and the bird is the hero of the art. That's the stuff that I like the best.
I can't let the opportunity go by there when we're talking about photography as art, which I certainly agree with. Who's a bird photographer that you revere? And if you've got different ones for different locations. Give us an opportunity to find out some that I can look up later and the listeners can chase up later.
There's a lady in WA who's really something, and I always get her name wrong, Georgina Steydler, and I may not even be pronouncing that properly.
Steydler, the pencils.
No, it's actually Steytler, Georgina Steydler.
So Steydler, okay.
And I think that her work, really does represent what you can do with photography as art when it comes to wildlife, but especially birds. And in terms of, it's not just about one shot and one idea. It's about trying to bring in the entire environment. It's about the colors. It's about the light. And I see actually that this is actually something new. I think she's actually starting to play with the micro four thirds, the smaller cameras too now, which is interesting because she was always with the bigger cameras. That's good to see if she started to play around with the smaller cameras too. But her work is beautiful. It's really beautiful. It's art. It's absolutely art. And it's art that comes out of understanding her subject and caring about the subject.
Now, you came out of a sort of an academic background as a photographer. So you were the photographer for an academic purpose.
No, actually. I actually used to work in the department at the university, but my role there was science, not photography.
Okay.
But it did give me a chance. It gave me an opportunity to experiment and to play. But it really wasn't until I had a career change where I said, actually, I need to get back into something that was more creative. And that's really the key word. For me, the reason that I love photography is actually because it's a chance to be creative. It's a chance to create something beautiful and to see the world in a different way.
I just want to see if we can neatly connect the dots. Was the role at Melbourne University that you had that was academic, was that giving you an opportunity to develop photography skills as inclusive in the role, or was photography always just hanging out there as an interest?
No, what it gave me is that it gave me access to, there's a lot of factors that come into how I got to this point. My time in academia gave me the resources to spend my weekends taking photos. That's probably the better way to put it. But it also, when you work with a whole bunch of scientists, what you learn is just because you can't do something today doesn't mean you can't learn to do it tomorrow.
Yeah, and they have an extended time frame of reference, don't they? Because
that's
studies and surveys and whatnot take time. And so, we'll just go and do it today.
You ever talk to friends who say, "Oh, that's great what you do. I could never do that," and you think, "No, you could. You absolutely could do that." But if your attitude is, "I could never do that," then you
get self-fulfilling prophecy.
To hang out with a bunch of amazing people, really smart people, really talented, young, energetic. Of course, they weren't all young. There were some crusty old wise people in there too, because it's university. But to hang out with those people and just learn, if I want to do this, I can just work it out. That's my job now, is to work out how to get from A to B, even though no one's been to that point before. That's my job today. And if you take that into your personal life, you think, okay, I could have a different career as well. I don't have to stay in this career. I can find a different way to build a career. And that's how the photography came in, and then the travel came in, and then the guiding came in.
So what was the first commission? Photographers all usually working on commission. What was your first commission that was bird-based?
That was Andrew Stafford. We were both hired to join a trip to the Northern Territory with the tourist board up there to take a lot of photographs of the wildlife and the birds up there. And so I can't even remember whether it was, maybe it was only even 4 days or something like that. Like it felt like a month, but it was only like a couple of days. And I had to actually buy some new gear to do the trip. I had to actually invest. And I sold my motorcycle to buy a lens.
Don't we all know those kind of situations, mate?
Yeah.
So where did that lead? I'm assuming that was completely satisfying for you. You've met Andrew, so that's a new contact, and he's probably a good entry point into the mysterious Australian bird world. So what was next?
I spent, that would have been like close to 20 years ago now, maybe close to 15. It's hard to recall now. The problem with wildlife photography in general is that it's a hard career to make money. And we talk about that it's hard to make money in travel, but I think it's even harder in wildlife, to be honest. So unless you're an absolute specialist, it's very hard to bring that into a financial context. And tours is one way that you can stretch that a bit. I was leading a trip to Borneo to shoot orangutans. We had a group that we put together to take photos and to hold an exhibition and to raise funds for the zoo. A long story, but there are people who wanted to go to Borneo and to have a photography trip there. And so we thought, well, let's do something useful with that. And we're in this amazing part of Borneo called the Dunham Valley. And I'm really lucky. I've been there twice. And the second time that we were there, we met a guy called Nick Garbett. And Nick is actually a British wildlife photographer who's been doing it since a long time before the digital stuff came along. And he was just a really nice guy. He was kind enough to share some snakes and some frogs and all that kind of thing. You know, he was going to this place quite a lot, and he would just get the groundskeepers to keep any snakes that they found while they were tending to the gardens in the week before his group turns up, and so that people have some snakes that they can pose and photograph and all that sort of thing. So, you know, now a guy like Nick has really struggled to have a financially rewarding career. But I think he has achieved such amazing things with his photography and its beautiful work that hopefully the lack of financial rewards is not hurting him too much.
Borneo is somewhere that I've always wanted to go. And I think I first saw really great bird photography from Borneo, I think from looking at, I think it was Philip Mather's website,
right,
quite a few years ago. He's Melbourne based, but I think he and his wife have a tour business too, I think. But how difficult is it to work in Borneo?
It's hot and sticky, and I don't like hot and sticky. It's not my thing. But unfortunately, that's where all the best food is. Usually where it's hot and sticky, that's where the good food is as well.
And when you say Borneo, are you talking Malaysia or Indonesia for the part you're at?
I've never been to Kalimantan, to the Indonesian part of it, yeah. But I have gone to Sabah and Sarawak quite a lot, and I recommend it. I really do. It's so easy to get over there. The Malaysian people make it really easy for us to travel in terms of the language. They're lovely people. The food is fantastic. And the wildlife is off the dial. It really is. It's such an amazing place. And I highly recommend it. And I'd love to go back and to do some dedicated wildlife work. But most of my wildlife work is in the context of something else. So I don't do a feature just on a particular species or place. I'm trying to bring the wildlife into the travel context.
Yeah, we'll explore that again a little bit later. There's so many things I've got on my list now, because just thinking about how you said how difficult it was for someone with amazing skills to make a living out of it. So you do have to turn everything into a composite. But let's keep tracking your journey. So you've discovered Borneo and you've discovered that you're really into this. You're never going back to academia. I think you've made that decision by now. Where was next? Did you decide on a location you wanted to do, or did you have some other aim in the next step of your career progression?
Now, let me just point out something about a career in academia, just as I feel it's relevant. I used to work for a really nice bloke called Jeff Shaw, who was a very patient man and just a wonderful teacher. And the honest to goodness truth was, I wasn't as good as this stuff as most of the other people in the building, and it's better that I got out. And he was very tolerant and very patient, but I'm not sure I was the sharpest pencil in the drawer for the skills you need to do really good science. Because science, you've got to be really consistent. It's all about the consistency.
Yeah.
And that's a very different game to being creative. You do have to be creative in terms of problem solving, but you can't screw up from day to day and still expect to get good data out of it, basically.
No, I'm not sure that an artistic bent and a reliable scientific methodology always complementary in the same body.
When I started off down this path, I knew I wanted to travel. And then as like the travel work started to really come together, start to build into a career, and we started doing some photo tours and stuff, the birds were always part of that. So there's a publication in the UK called Food and Travel. It's like a precursor to Gourmet Traveller. It's family owned still, really great publication. I'm really glad that I get to work with those guys, and they're really talented. And so every time I get like a 12-page spread on whether it's Tasmania or Perth or the Fijis, I make sure there's a couple of birds in there. And every time they run the birds, because the birds give you a sense of place. You know, like when we did a story in Auckland, we had to have some tuis in there. And then we did one down in the South Island, and we got to see one of the gannet colonies, and we got some beautiful shots of gannets down there. That was an amazing place to go. And so the birds are a really good part of the travel context. that sense of place. Where in the world are you? Well, a bird can tell you that.
There's so many things that I want to talk about, but I'm mindful of trying to keep it on one plane for the moment. When did you consider yourself as having successfully become a photographer? Do you still not pigeonhole yourself as a photographer? Are you also a tour guide / entrepreneur? Do you have a pigeon?
Right.
Do you have a pigeonhole for yourself yet?
I call myself an editorial photographer. How I take photographs in order to tell stories so it's about capturing a series of images, not one single image to tell a story. And that's part of the editorial stance, is that you also need to recognize that when you share images and share your photos, you're sharing a particular perspective, and your perspective is only one of them, and you get to choose what that perspective is. And if there's one thing that a lot of photographers let themselves down in, is that they're not actually committing to a perspective. They're not saying, here's what I want to say. Here's what I want you to take away from this photo or this series or this work. I make the argument that there's no such thing as a documentary, that in fact everything is art, because at the end of the day, the photographer's perspective always determines where that's going to head. And that at every step of the way, whether it's the producer, the photographer, the editor, even the processing, all of these can influence what that image actually reveals, what it emphasizes, and that
makes the viewer feel.
That's right, because, the photographer is saying, I want you to see this, I want you to feel this, I want you to think this. You have a perspective when you share that work. You're choosing what to photograph, what to share. Obviously, there's other people involved in that as well, but the photographer has a perspective, and that means it's always art.
And look, I'll push it a bit further. When you view the work you're doing in that context and describing art that way, the art is always political as well, because you are deciding what the message is. I really like that analysis that you have of so many photographers, be they professional or hobbyist, who don't commit to a message. I hadn't really given it any thought before, but now that I think about all of the photography websites that I've been perusing in the last week or two, and yeah, that's a feeling I often came away with, that these things are pretty, but they're not telling me anything. And do you think there's different consumers of photography, and particularly wildlife and bird photography? Do you think there's those who want the message and those who don't?
If you go to your social media and you see all the pictures of birds in the groups and in your Instagram and all that kind of stuff, it's a little bit depressing. There's lots of beautiful photography of birds out there, and how much of it is doing any good for the birds?
That's led me really nicely into another issue or question I have for you about being a guide and going to some of the amazing places that we haven't even referenced yet. You and I know we haven't even got there yet. Tread lightly, those kind of concepts, and having a broader view of the preservation or the protection of the habitat, and more specifically the birds therein. How much of a guiding principle is that for you? And let's extend it back to what we were talking about, the bigger operators, tour operators. How often is that a guiding principle in your experience?
For me, it's absolutely key. It's cost me friendships. Like, I've had to let go of friends. So
I don't think we want to name names, but can you give us some of the issues? Yeah, can you give us some of the issues that cause that conflict?
Okay, I have to couch this in a way so that I don't name names. We don't need any Christian Porters in the travel world pulling me up at this point. So there was a company that was running a lot of trips into the hill tribes of Thailand. So you would do like a 1-week hike, and you'd stay in people's houses when you're up there and all that kind of stuff. And the idea was the profits from those kind of treks would basically be spread around the community. And it sounds really good. Unfortunately, what was really happening was that the chiefs in each of the villages would get to say who got the money and who didn't, who got the opportunity and who didn't. And then the tours were going from 2 or 3 per month to, I got to a point where I looked that in the month of April, this particular company had 43 departures going instead of 3 or 4. It was 43. This is just one company. You've got issues when other companies start to jump into the gold rush and all this kind of stuff. And the area is being trampled with tourists. The money was really actually dividing the communities. People were seeing the money from those treks as being, it really was a gold rush. Why should I go out and spend the next 10 weeks harvesting rice and to plant rice and all this kind of stuff if I can make 10 times as much just by having a few people come and stay at my house? So the money doesn't always do good, and it doesn't always do good for everyone. So the ethics of tourism is very complicated. You can't just say, oh, it's good, we're providing some cash to people. It just doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes it absolutely does. Sometimes it's like, actually, I met this wonderful guide in China who was actually starting to work for this 5-star hotel where she got paid much better and she'd gone up a notch, and she was able to give her old job to someone else who, for them, they got an upgrade, and a whole bunch of people got upgrades because this 5-star hotel in this quiet part of China. So it can be good. It's not that it's all bad. It's just that you can't assume it's good. So in the case of this company, they said, we just want to see whether we have an impact. So when they were doing 3 or 4 people per month, they were prepared to work with an academic program just to research the impact of tourism. When they got to 43 per month, they said, oh, look, we don't really want to continue with that research. Thanks. Let's shut that down. Let's not talk about that anymore. And we can't walk away from the fact that tourism is not always good. And whether we're talking about the communities being crushed in some hill tribes in Thailand, or whether we're talking about people using techniques that actually could potentially harm birds so they can get their photograph. Because there's this danger that when you care so much about the photograph, you want that photograph because you've seen like 10 other photos that have gone onto social media that might be better than yours, and you really want that photograph to show that you're just as good as those guys. And there's this danger that you push yourself to get the photograph and you're no longer caring about the bird at all. You care about your ego at that point.
It's a difficult issue. Just the last time I went to Bali, which is, I think it was 2014, I went to the Bali Bird Park and I'd researched it beforehand and I'd made contact so that I would get to meet some of the research staff who were attached to the park. And I had a chat with them, and I'll have to post the embarrassing photos. So I had at the time a rig that was supposed to be good for mobile podcasting. It was state of the art for the time. Let me down. None of my recordings survived, but I've got the photos of a macaw on my head and with my headphones and a microphone thing. They're very embarrassing photographs. But I got the opportunity to speak to the research staff there, and I really thought the work that they were doing, because there's a couple of icon species in Bali particularly that are looking at extinction. But then I sat down and did the bird show, sat there for the bird show when they have the birds of prey swooping around and the macaws and everything. And I had a real problem with that because most of the people who were there were just there for the pretty big coloured birds. And I'm thinking, why is there a macaw at the Bali Bird Park? So
right, put that in context.
But it's the same feeling I have when I go to Healesville Sanctuary, and I don't want to disparage Healesville Sanctuary because I have a really deep love for the place from as a kid. But why are they doing the photos with the koala sitting in a cut tree stump with some daggy foliage?
Yeah, look,
and I understand the paradox, I understand the conflict, but I wonder how long we're going to support and promote and indeed push forward. All the tourism stories we've been seeing lately about recovering from the pandemic, they've all had the gratuitous shot of the koala in a stump sitting in this little coverall shelter for photo opportunities for people. The message is wrong. Get out there and see koalas in the wild. I don't know how we deal with that, and that must be an issue for everyone who runs a commercial.
There's a really interesting podcast called Species, and they have an episode on the red panda and the relationship between zoos, trying to run programs to do their captive breeding and to protect them and that kind of stuff. And then, in fact, the zoo's actually funding this issue of actually funding the pandas being taken out of the wild and actually exacerbating the problem. It's complicated, and there's not a clear answer when it comes to the zoos. There's not a clear answer when it comes to travel. And I once tried to write an article about how to make your tourism much more ethical. And at the end of the day, because it's so hard, because I would try to reach out to lots of different tour companies and say, okay, what can you tell me that you're doing that's going to make a difference? And I literally had P&O's agency sent me back saying, oh, look, we ask people not to change their towels every day in the cabins. So seriously, guys, this is what you're offering up. This is how you're going to save the planet. Your ship is using 10 tons of fuel to get from one stop to the next. And you want to say, oh, yeah, just save that towel for a second day, mate. We'll be right.
But that, I'm sure they would say it's not our job to save the planet.
But as a consumer, the only piece of advice that I could give, because the consumers could talk till they're blue in the face to the companies, and they wouldn't know. They wouldn't know who's actually screwing over the local guides. They wouldn't know who is actually using dirty fuel in their ships and all this kind of stuff. My advice was, the smaller the company you travel with, the more likely that someone in that company knows about the problems and has a voice to do something about it. And that was the only thing I could come up with.
And I would extend that further. The smaller the company that you deal with as a consumer, the more your voice, your opinion, and your view will have an effect as well. If you're on the tour and you see something bad happening and you say, I'm going out of my way to tell 25 people never to come near you, that has more of an effect than not booking, really. Telling. Yeah. Now, let's get back to birds. Bhutan, Kenya, the southern extremities of New Zealand, Borneo. Where else have we got amazing bird locations that you've been on?
Here's one that you probably haven't actually come up with very often. Iceland.
Yeah, Iceland. Yeah. I've actually read quite a few accounts of people who have gone off the track to Iceland, but you've got to be very selective about when you go. And look, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Iceland have a very strict numbers quoted who they will allow to go to the spots, because particularly where you've got the waders and whatnot nesting, I think they really control that.
Yeah, look, like everything in Iceland, they're very organized and they handle it very well. And it's such a great experience to go to Iceland anyway, and to have a reason like this, to be out there in this incredible wilderness, this incredible landscape that's so extreme and so harsh. I highly recommend it. And you get to see birds. Lots and lots of birds. I can't remember the number, but it was like millions and millions of these migratory birds that come in to feed up and to spend the Icelandic summer, or the month of June and May, perhaps. Like, it's a short window that you've got, and you've got to be there at the right time. But there are things there where your guide will probably be able to organize to take you to a tiny island somewhere where there are 10 people and 6 million puffins. And it's wonderful. Who wouldn't want to do that? I'd love to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, look, I've said this before. I think the very first episode with Steph Burrell, who doesn't love a puffin? How can you not love a puffin?
It's so marvelous.
So I noticed on your website, you've got the feature, you make a big feature of Bhutan and Kenya. Tell us about how going to Bhutan came about and the whole Himalayas. I've always wanted to go to Mongolia and see the plains of Mongolia, especially since I studied with someone who was from Mongolia, and it just sounded like the most offbeat kind of country. They've organised themselves. Tell us about the Himalayas.
The Himalayan experience for me is primarily Bhutan and Nepal. And they're such different countries. Culturally, they are absolutely worlds apart. Nepal is a chaotic. It's actually hard work to run a tour when I go to Nepal, because trying to get a good guide who's not gonna try to actually to take advantage of your passengers and the tour company and all that kind of stuff. It actually can be pretty hard. The best guides. The guides who speak the best English don't tend to hang around long. There's lots of other stuff that they can be doing. But as a photographer, Nepal has this amazing diversity. It's much drier compared to the Bhutanese side of the Himalayas, because a lot of the forest has been chopped down and that kind of stuff. And when you get up to a higher altitude, it's all rocks rather than trees and things like that. It's just a very different kind of experience. Whereas when you go to Bhutan, it's much more organized. The government runs everything. The guides are fantastic. The English is great. People try maybe even a little bit too hard just to be nice. Sometimes I have to explain to my guide there, I say, look, you're trying really hard, but there's nothing you can do to make that person happy. You just need to stop. And the team I have in Bhutan, I've had the same guide for 10 years. The team I have in Nepal, I've got a great guide now, but it's taken a long time to get one who doesn't drink too much and that kind of stuff. And they're not the same standard. And that's just part of the overall chaos when you go to Nepal. So from a wildlife perspective, Nepal's chaos is the word that comes out the whole time. You can be in the middle of Kathmandu and there's this beautiful temple that's called Swayambunat, and it's on the top of this hill, and people go there to see the sunrise because it's actually quite high up above the city, but it's still actually surrounded by suburbs and stuff. But half of the hill is just these beautiful old trees. And there's probably 25 species of birds there. It's just, you can go there with a camera and spend 2 hours and your card's full, because they're just all in this little tiny park on the side of a hill. These beautiful tits and abs. So when it comes to actually naming birds, I have to get my head into the right space there.
The zone.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, when you're changing countries as well. And I don't know the names of the birds as well as an actual expert. And I'm a photographer, not a birder, not claiming to be otherwise. So even in the middle of Kathmandu, you can find these wonderful little birds, lots of them. And then when you go up into the mountains, into the Annapurnas, the wall creepers and the thrushes and the rose finches and things like that, there's a lot to see. And then you go to Bhutan and it's just hundreds and hundreds of species. Every time you change altitude by a couple of hundred meters, there's a whole new opportunity where there's like dozens more birds. And, because I've been able to go to Bhutan just to see birds, whereas I haven't had time to do that when I go to Nepal. But when I go to Bhutan and I've actually been there just to see birds, and it's just so easy. They're everywhere. They're just absolutely everywhere, because most of Bhutan is wild, most of Nepal, not so wild. They're very different experiences. But yeah, the birds are great. And because Bhutan is one of those places where I actually got a chance to take a camera and to shoot birds and to hang out with the bird guide, a really good bird guide. And there is nothing in this world more wonderful than spending time with a quality bird guide, because that just changes everything. It really does.
Do we do the shout out?
Yeah. Let's talk about EJ. Got a time constraint here. The in-laws are coming for 12 o'clock lunch, but I can't say everything I'd like to say.
Well, I just wanted to say that if people are hanging out in bird Twitter, they've probably seen him. It's birding in Bhutan, isn't it?
So the actual Twitter handle is Bhutan
Bird. That's
yeah. And so it's a guy called EJ. Is just one of the nicest people I have ever met. And I really hope I get to do a couple more trips with him. He's so gentle. He just loves the moment when he knows he's about to show you a bird that you've never seen and that you didn't even know existed. And he knows he's about to share that. And he makes sure that the moment is whole, that it doesn't get ruined. And he's so generous. When I first met him, because I was planning a shoot there as part of some work with Panasonic, and I didn't feel he was very chatty or very responsive and didn't have much to say. And I thought, I don't know if he's going to be able to do this job. He's a bit quiet. He's a bit too chill. And of course, what I didn't realize is that he was just trying to be respectful, just like he's just trying so hard to show respect and to not take over the moment, to take over the scene. And so once you actually spend some time with him and he comes out of his shell more, and he just does such a great job. His expertise, of course, with the birds is fantastic. His expertise with cameras is actually fantastic as well. But we were in a hotel during this bird trip that we were doing, and some of the pictures in the lobby, I reckon I've seen them before somewhere. They were a couple of sunbirds. And EJ came in and said, they're my pictures. Where'd you get those pictures? And someone had taken his pictures off Twitter and they'd actually printed it up and sold them to the hotel.
Imagine that, Ewan. Someone stealing your pictures off and passing them off as their own.
Yeah. You just have to put up with it. There's not much you can do to stop it.
You can't,
So,
unless you watermark everything in the with a watermark in the focal point of the image.
That's right. That's right. You can, and that my principle has always been: I want the world to see the photos,
to see your work. Yeah,
I don't want to put effort into stopping people from seeing my photos.
Yeah. No,
so it's hard. It's hard to get that right.
That's right. There is plenty. It's not a world of scarcity. Now, let's talk for a little bit about East Africa, about Kenya. I've always had the idea. First, have you worked in only Kenya, or have you done Tanzania, Uganda, and anywhere else there? So that's the first question. The second one, how difficult is it to work in that part of the world?
Oh, it's not. Again, it's all down to the guide. The guides are fantastic. Well, my guide is. I don't know about everyone else's guide.
Without wanting to be so political, but I would have thought that it would be very difficult to work in Uganda these days.
Oh, okay. I spend my time in Kenya.
Okay, so
I'm not talking about Africa.
Yeah, so that leads on to part of the skill of doing what you do is finding a country and even a location within the country that is stable and that you can rely on. You can rely on the relationships and you can rely on the society to accept what you're doing.
Yeah. Look, one of the hard things with what I do is that I often will go and shoot for a publication and think, it'd be really nice to run a tour here. These people are nice. This place is nice. I can see some opportunity here. And at the end of the day, there's only so many places in the world I can do and do well. Because you've got to know it well enough to actually to do some service to the people who are going to be traveling with you,
to your clients.
And I can't just become an expert on 68 countries. That's not going to really fly. And the other thing is I love where the connections happen. So I love the comparison between Bhutan to Nepal. I love the difference between Sweden to Norway. I love these kind of the way things juxtaposition. And I used to spend a lot of time in Southeast Asia. So Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. And it's the subtle differences as you move from one part of like if you move, because cultures go across the boundaries in ways that we tend to think that Thailand is different from Laos. But if you go up to northern Thailand, there's a whole bunch of tribes up there that are actually the same tribes as when you go over the border to Laos. And culture has gradients, and it's not always by the country.
And a lot of the maps and the political impositions have been determined 150 years ago by people sitting in Europe, not by the people who are occupying the land.
Yeah. Yes. So, for me, the rule is when I decide to start a whole new tour, it's because I know the team on the ground are the right team for me to work with, that they understand the needs of the photographers, or in this case, the birders as well, and that they have the right kind of resources so that when something goes wrong, I know that they're going to do the right thing, because things always go wrong. And you need to know that your ground team is up to it.
Before we get into the standard bird emergency questions, let's talk about some of the things that have gone wrong. Hopefully you can find some anecdotes to share with us that aren't too horrific and that might even lend towards the humorous. What's some of the disasters that have happened on a tour that you've been in charge of?
Actually, yesterday was the anniversary. I'm just trying to think of what year. It was actually the 10-year anniversary of a guy who died on a trip with me.
Oh, no.
That was yesterday. Yeah. And he was a really lovely bloke. And he had basically retired 3 months before he came on the trip. And he and his wife were like, great, we're going to spend the rest of our life traveling and enjoy it. And he's worked hard. And he was just a really nice guy. He was just really gentle. And he did spend the rest of his life traveling with his wife. Unfortunately, she had to continue her journey in life without him. And that was terribly sad. We were in the Annapurnas, and that was a pretty awful couple of days.
Have you had any other anecdotes that have been a bit funny that haven't resulted in one of your clients?
Oh, look, things go wrong the whole time. Like one of the hardest things we have is just get people to turn up to dinner at the right time.
Punctuality, that's everywhere, isn't it?
There was one trip where there was this one guy who, and it took me a while to work out what was happening, but he just wouldn't listen to the time. And it's funny because I've been doing these trips for a long time now, and I've learned if you can just make the dinner time the same time every day, that goes a long way to actually avoiding confusion. And even so, this guy would go, I think he probably said something like 7:30. And then he'd start telling people in the group 7:30. And then people would come back to me and say, "Oh, I'm sure that you said 7:30," and it's because they heard him say it, not that I heard me say it. They heard him saying 7:30, and he would just sow this confusion amongst the rest of the group because he was a bit of a talker, and he was chaos. Absolute chaos.
I was tempted to ask you what nationality he was, but I'm not going to go there.
South was as close as I can come to that. He was a nice guy, but honestly, he was hard work.
Yeah. Look, I fear that we're going to have to, maybe on the next anniversary of the episode with Ewen Bell, that we might have to do the next episode with Ewen Bell, because by then you'll have probably been to some more amazing locations. But before we give you the opportunity to plug what's coming up next in your calendar, let's see how we can adapt the bird emergency questions to photography and tour guiding. What's your favourite piece of gear when you are out doing some photography for pleasure rather than for profit?
Certainly the G9 with the 100 to 400 on it. That combo is just great. That's the camera which I take when I go up to Royal Park and I just want to actually enjoy some time with the birds. The photography gives me a focus because you might get a great shot of a pardalote or an eastern spinebill or something like that. You never know what you'll find up there. And because it's so easy to carry, and the thing that was really good about that camera when it came out, because the Micro Four Thirds took some time to get it right. It was a process to get the technology working well. And the thing that held me back was that the viewfinders were too small. I couldn't see enough. So the autofocus works great, but if the viewfinder is too small, you can't see what you're focusing on. And they nailed it with this G9. It was like the first camera they came out with that I got genuinely excited about in Micro Four Thirds. You can see what you're trying to shoot. It captures 60 frames per second raw. It's got this pre-burst mode so that it's actually taking photos before you commit the shutter. And once you see the bird actually move and throw out the wings, and then you commit the shutter the rest of the way, anything that was in that pre-burst gets kept, gets written to card, and that works really well. And the first time I got to take this camera, I was running a trip in Kenya, and usually I would take the SLR gear and all that kind of stuff. And I felt very nervous about turning up with a camera that was like straight out of the factory, wasn't quite in production yet. And the guys said, "You're going to love it." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, if you say so." And I couldn't believe it. The shots I was getting on that trip, there were shots that I wouldn't have got any other way. And that's what I think is really great about the smaller cameras and the way the technology can change your experience with birds, is the idea that you get something back for effort that you're putting in. You get a reward for the work that you're putting in, and that it made it much more worthwhile. And it got to the point in Kenya where you've got your tent and you have to walk to the main tent to have lunch. And I would have to basically leave an hour earlier, because if I'm holding that camera, I'm going to shoot like 10 birds by the time I get to the tent for the lunch stop. And I just had to leave this extra time to walk anywhere because I could get photos that I would never have got if I was trying to haul around the great big heavy gear, which could actually scare off the birds perhaps, but also I'm just not as likely to carry it if it's that heavy and that big and that cumbersome. So the camera's given me a chance to enjoy the birds even more, and that's what I really love.
Just extending that a little bit, what do you use to transport your gear? Are you traveling with a couple of hard cases, or do you have a backpack, and do you take a laptop with you on a trip like this?
Totally, yeah. Just a MacBook Pro is what I used to use. I've had that for 10 years. I actually just changed over to the M1 Mac. And so now I've got the MacBook Air. It's so light and so tiny, and it's so fast. It's great hardware. You want to go through your photos every day. You want to download stuff off the cards and put it onto your hard drives and see what you've got. Particularly if you're doing commercial work, you need to see where are the bits I didn't get today so I can go out and get those bits tomorrow. So yes, I've always got the laptop and I've got plenty of hard drives, and I can put basically two G9s and a handful of lenses plus a drone plus a laptop into one standard camera bag, and that goes on my back. And that means I can get that on the plane, I can get it on a bus, I can get it on a Jeep. I just don't have to worry. It's low stress.
Well, I have to ask, I'm not sure if one will be interested, but I certainly am. How do you get a drone in there as well? It must be a very small drone.
Yeah. The drones come in various sizes, but Havoc Air was the one that I used to travel with quite a lot. I've changed over to the Havoc Pro 2, I think it's called. The lockdown happened. I took one up to the Arctic, and it's a slightly bigger drone, but still it doesn't take up that much space. So the drone is about the size of my telephoto lens, and then I can drive it off my phone. So the phone just becomes the screen. In fact, I don't need to have the controller. I can actually pair the drone up directly to the phone. It's harder to control it, and that's not what you want in a drone. You generally want it to be easy to control. But if you're really confined for space, drones don't take up that much space at all. And when you've got things like the G9 is your main platform, you've got room to stick a drone in the bag too.
I'll have to get you to send me the link for that, because I'm sure people will be very interested in a small footprint drone that would do the job. Okay, the bucket list question. Where's your bucket list location?
I'd like to see places like Tunisia, that part of Africa.
Are you thinking the whole northern shore, or are you particularly thinking Tunisia and Tunis? Or are you looking at Mauritania and Morocco as well?
I have spent some time in Morocco and I like it there. I've had some good experiences there, and there's so much of the world that I haven't seen. So I guess that one's kind of thrown me, because I don't tend to think in terms of where else that I want to go. I just tend to think I've been really lucky, and my focus at the moment is I can't wait to get back to bringing people to Bhutan, to Nepal, to Norway, to the outback, because I've got teams there in Kenya, because I've got teams there who really need some work and they really need to make some money, and they've had a really bad year. And so my focus is actually, I just want a chance to keep going back and to share it with other people.
I dig that spirit of generosity. I think that's a really, I don't want to say honourable, because I don't think that it makes you any. I think everybody should be thinking that way. That what can I do in my endeavours that helps somebody else where they are, and I think that's a great way to look at any kind of commercial operation that you're getting involved in.
Now, these are my friends, people I care about. We've been talking on Zoom sort of once every month or two. And there's a couple of months there where some of the guys in the Himalayas were just really depressed and they didn't even want to talk. They were going through a really bad trot. One guy's had to sell off a whole bunch of stuff to try to keep going. And one of my mates is like a part owner in this little tiny hotel in Kathmandu. And apparently he owns the hotel, but he doesn't own the land that the hotel's on. Yep. So he rents the land that he built a hotel on, which sounds weird.
That's pretty normal in Asia, isn't it?
Yeah. And so he owes tens of thousands of dollars to the dude who owns the land, and he has no idea when he's going to be able to pay it back. These are my friends, and I'm at a stage of life where I don't feel I need to see everything and do everything and achieve everything. I feel I've had a pretty good run, and I'm really grateful for the people that I've got to meet. And I just want to make sure that I get to spend a bit more time with those people and try to help them in the way that they've helped me, because their success is my success.
Totally. That's why aren't you the Minister for Industrial Relations? Now,
wouldn't join the Liberal Party.
Let's get a smile back on the dial. Have you? Even though you're not a hardcore birder, so you're not at the extreme end of the birding spectrum, have you got a bucket list bird? Is there something that, even in the locations that you're really familiar with, is there something that has eluded you and you're thinking next time?
You know what? I can't even say that I have. Perhaps the closest would be the Gouldian.
Oh, okay.
So one of the trips I do in Outback, we have a private plane and we go to some amazing places. And this is places to the south of Wyndham, so to the east of Kununurra. And it's an old cattle ranch that's now been turned into this kind of a quasi-eco resort kind of thing, but really posh. Like, it costs a bomb to be there. But you never know, right? You never know, you like the big city.
Unless they invite me to do a review.
I get to go there and I can't afford it. So, you know how these things happen. But the people who bought it, they realize the value of the ecological habitat there. So there's this particular pond that's quite close to the farmhouse there. And we just basically walk down to the pond, we walk around the pond, and it's about half the size of the MCG. It's not that big. And we see like the starfinches, we see the zebra finches, we see the double barred and all this kind of stuff. And then the last time I was there with a group, we also saw some Gouldian finch. Now, we break up the group into two sort of smaller groups so that we have a crack at actually being able to see them. So the group that I was with got to see them at the tail end just as they were flushing through, and my guys got shots. So I would like a decent shot of a Gouldian finch, and I haven't got that at the moment. But if I die and I don't get a shot of a Gouldian finch, that's not really the end of the world. No. That's fine. But I do know that half of my group got some great shots of the Gouldian finch. So that makes me...
That is really good. And of course, when you do get the shot that you want of the Gouldian finch, you'll have a black, a yellow, and a red head all there, males and females.
I'll have all the colours.
Perfectly arranged on an arching branch. So.
That's right. That's right. With the background completely soft. Yeah, I find that the more I spend time on social media seeing the bird shots that people have basically staged where they've got their branch, they put down some food or they're playing a bird call, they just all look the same after a while. And I stop enjoying it because I see the formula behind the shots. And I don't enjoy that as much as someone who's got a shot of a parrot that's hiding in the branches and you can only see half the beak and all that kind of stuff. Okay, he didn't make that one up. He didn't cheat to get that shot.
I don't know if you know the name because I grew up being a member of Aviculture Australia, and as a little kid thinking, I want to have all these parrots and breed them. I had this idea that you could captively breed all these endangered birds and save the world. Naivety. But the Aviculture magazine had Horst Mueller using his photographers, and I think he was from Belgium, Germany or Belgium, of all these amazing parrots and these finches and everything. But they're all either in aviaries, but what I learnt later was a lot of them were taxidermy specimens in a studio that as a kid I hadn't twigged to it. I see it now and I think, my God, I can't believe the editors of the magazine were using those photographs.
Wow. That reminds me, I'm just trying to think of the right spelling. There's a lady called Leila Jeffries. Portraiture of birds is the gold standard. So she's like completely different to Georgina Steydler that I referred to before. So Georgina goes out into the wild and it's all about context and the light and stuff like that. Leila literally is bringing birds into kind of a studio context. Yeah. She takes the studio to the birds, but she's doing portraits of birds and it's marvelous. It's beautiful photography. And she's definitely one to look up. Leila Jeffries with a J.
Of course, you'll send me the links so that I can put them in and make it really easy for... Now, here's where I think we've got to the end. I can't ask you all the standard birder questions because you're not a standard birder. Tell us what's coming up for you in 2021. And are there places that you would encourage people to visit, even if they're not on your tour itinerary for the next little while, that would really help some people out by booking a tour?
Definitely. Look, Kenya, Bhutan, Nepal, they absolutely rely on tourism so much. And also they do it really well. Okay, Nepalese have a little bit of a focus on like the trekking. So most people don't go to Nepal because they think they have to trek to see anything. And so that's a problem they have. The whole thing is all about the Sherpas and trying to go up Everest or doing the Annapurna circuit. You can see some amazing places when you go to Nepal without having to get out of the Jeep. Okay, you can still actually get around and see some things. I'm not into trekking up hills. I would much rather someone actually drive up, but you can see some beautiful places there. Bhutan, you can't go wrong. You just really can't go wrong. It's really well standardized. The government does a great job of that. They've actually just about completed their vaccine rollout. Can you believe? They started like a week and a half ago and they're mostly done. So they're going to be really well positioned that it'll be somewhere that's really safe to go, really well organized, and just the rewards are there. Whether you're there to see birds or see culture, and hopefully both, that's a really great place to go. And certainly Kenya. I know that at the moment you can actually go to Kenya and travel there now. We can't because we can't leave the country.
You can't get out of the country.
But the rest of the world can go and see Kenya. One of my regular travelers is over there right now, just like sending back these pictures of the leopards and all of this kind of stuff. I was chatting to my guy over there in Kenya, Chris, and he was saying he's actually done a couple of trips to the Masai Mara and it's the best time to be there because no one's there. The place is empty. The animals are loving it. The animals are really happy in the Maasai. They're enjoying it.
Yeah. So. And I'm sure that's happening all over the world with people not being in the environment. The natural world is probably fighting back. So what's on your tour schedule? You obviously probably don't have anything overseas locked in. What are you doing in Australia this year?
So this year there's There's a food photography workshop that I run with my wife. She's an incredible food stylist, photographer, recipe developer. She's amazingly talented. And so we run this workshop that goes for 4 days. It's like a professional development course, so that at the end of it, you should be able to do commercial stuff, whether it's for your cafe, your blog, your clients. So we've got that. That's all booked up in May. We've got an outback trip, which there might be one spot coming up for that, where we jump in a private plane and we fly out to cattle stations and Uluru and places like that. And we go to Purnululu. There's some fantastic birds to see in Purnululu. It's really, because there's not much water, but you've got this beautiful landscape there with lots of flowering grevilleas and all that stuff. That's a really good spot to see some desert birds on that trip. And then we go up to Arnhem Land and we do like the wetlands there, and we take a lot of photographs in the wetlands. So many birds to shoot up there in Arnhem. So that's really good. And so I think there might be one spot for that, because there's a guy who is in Auckland and he's not sure he's going to be able to actually come over the pond to do the trip. And then hopefully towards the end of the year, we'll be able to get out and travel, and hopefully we'll get back to Bhutan and to Nepal. And then at the start of next year, we have a trip in Arctic Norway to see the Northern Lights. We just basically spend 2 weeks shooting auroras and snow. And occasionally we see some beautiful golden eagles. We always get shots of golden eagles on that trip. They're all over the Arctic coastline, even in the middle of winter. They're amazing birds.
Scandinavia, bucket list for me too.
I love it up there. The reindeer, the salmon, char, lovely.
Mr. Ewen Bell, thank you for being part of the Bird Emergency. The website for Ewen is Ewen Bell, EwenBell.com. So it's not really a hard one. And trust me, you will love having a look at Ewen's birds. And look, as I've said many times, I love bird Twitter, and you're always participating in bird Twitter. If you hate social media, bird Twitter is a good way to find nice social media, if you can put up with the pirated photographs. So.
I think that today I might start to post some of the pictures of the sparrows that come onto the balcony here, and we'll see if anyone steals my sparrow photos. We'll see if they're valuable.
Well, Ewen, I'm going to just, before we wrap up, share my sparrow story. Growing up in Victoria, and I grew up in country Victoria, where there weren't many sparrows. And of course, I had the Gould League of Victoria books and everything, and sparrows, introduced birds, feral pest, hate them. Moved to Melbourne, the only birds just keeping out our finches. And that whole adolescent mentality that you have. When I first went to the Philippines, I grew to love the tree sparrow and the house sparrow as I went out to the provinces, and they were the first birds you saw everywhere. They got amazing little personalities. But I'd never, ever seen them as anything other than this big red marked pest. I hadn't given them a personality because they were keeping out these lovely finches that in all probability would never be found in Melbourne anyway. So yeah, sparrows. Enjoy them on the balcony on this festive weekend. And thanks. I've really enjoyed it. And I hope that people don't mind that we had a bit of a change in the format. But I think Photography Friday or Tour Guide Thursday might become a bit of a regular thing, because I think people need it. I think people need to be encouraged to get out on specific tours. And hopefully they're yours.
I've enjoyed this chat, and I think that we could have talked for 3 more hours at this stage too. So
I'm not against round 2, Ewen. I'm not against round 2 at all. Dear listener, you can tell us if you'd like to hear more of Ewen. That's really easy. All someone has to do is say, yeah, and I'd be right up for it.
Excellent,
so thanks again. And you mentioned your wife. Did she have a name? You didn't give her a name.
Shelley. So Shelley Freudevo, if you Google Iron Chef Shelley, because that's her social media persona, Iron Chef
Shelley. Iron Chef Shelley. Was she a fan of the show?
Indeed. We both love that show. So when I met her and her handle with Iron Chef, that was one of the things that drew me in. But she's very talented and her website is amazing. If you want some really killer recipes and stuff, we do have a cookbook that's on there now that you can actually download to your iPad and all that kind of stuff. And I managed to sneak in a few really lovely pictures of birds into the cookbook as well.
Fantastic. Well, do send me those links and I'll include them. Enjoy the weekend, Ewan. Thanks so much for speaking with me and sharing your experience and expertise with the bird emergency. Ciao, everyone.